Well, greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to history class. Me and Johnny Cash greet you. This one's going to be a little bit of a quick one because I had a big lunch and I'm kind of having the whole post-lunch food coma thing, so I want to get this one over with relatively quick. At least that's the plan. But we really don't have a ton of ground to cover anyway because we're actually just about to the end of this thing. It's amazing how much ground you can cover when you don't have to stop for tests and reviews, huh? So despite me missing pretty much the whole month of January and us moving at a snail's pace for the first month of lockdown, we're still managed to finish this massive thing. So anyway. So today we're going to pick up the story. We've kind of brought you to the present in terms of European history. Today we're going to kind of bring you to the present in terms of Asian history. And then next week, as we wrap up, we'll kind of catch you up on Latin America, a little bit of what was going on in Africa the last little bit, the Middle East, and then the phenomenon known as globalization, which kind of affects the whole world. So anyway, so today we'll pick up starting where we talked about where we left off with the Chinese, and then we'll go visit the Japanese for a minute as well. We've pretty much brought you to the present on India. So kind of when we last left the situation in China, Mao Zedong was still the ruler, but Mao is going to die in the late 1960s. And, of course, we mentioned that, China and Russia had kind of had a little bit of a split. And this kind of came up when we did the Cold War video where we looked at this phenomenon more from the American perspective. But so they had their split. And then if you remember, there was this moment where the economy was in real bad shape in China. So some of the people kind of started to push back against the extreme communism, and Mao responded by encouraging this radical movement known as the Cultural Revolution. And the Cultural Revolution is this terrible, paranoid type phenomenon of persecuting dissent. And the reality is that rather than saving radical communism, the Cultural Revolution kind of dooms it because people begin to associate it with the excesses of that movement. So when Mao dies, he's going to be replaced by a guy by the name of Zhou Enlai. And Zhou Enlai is going to open up diplomatic relations with the United States. This was, as we talked about from the Americans' perspective, this was a priority of the American President Richard Nixon, and part of establishing the era known as détente, which was most of the 1970s, which is the period where the Cold War started to tone down for a little while before ramping back up around 79 and 80. Ultimately, Zhou is going to rule for a little while. He's going to, famously, sign the treaty with Nixon, which leads to the beginnings of some trade with the Chinese. He has this famous moment where he invites the American ping pong team to China, and which was immortalized in the movie Forrest Gump, which is my favorite movie of all time. It's like, we thought the best way to fight the communists was to go back to Vietnam, but they said it was to play ping pong, so that's what I did. We was like the first Americans in China in like 1 billion years or something. So anyway, you had the whole ping pong diplomacy thing and a little bit of increasing relationship with the United States. Keep in mind, though, that the Chinese government is still throwing thousands of dissenters in prison, during all of this. Anyone who disagrees with the government about anything is still very liable to be treated very terribly. One thing actually that is going on in China at this time is China actually starts a massive move toward Christianization, not with the support of the government. The government is fighting it tooth and nail, and has been. But there's now a very substantial Christian population in China that really started exploding in the 70s and 80s, and literally millions of Chinese people became Christians. And most of the Christian churches are illegal, except for the government has approved one particular denomination that they have a certain amount of control over, and so they can tell them, not to preach certain things against communism or whatever. But a lot of the majority of the movement in the Chinese movement toward Christianity has been in independent house churches that meet at risk of their life. Anyway, so while all that's happening, Zhou rules for a few years He ultimately is going to be replaced by a guy by the name of Deng Xiaoping. You don't need to remember all of these names, but you do want to remember Deng. You don't have to necessarily know how to spell Xiaoping. Maybe try to recognize it. If you see it on a quiz, it's like XIA PING, something like that, give or take a letter. But so Deng Xiaoping is a proponent of relative moderation compared to a communist government. He starts allowing more free enterprise, starts allowing ownership of private property. He undoes the collective farms that Mao had put together, where he'd murdered all these peasants to like create these government-owned and operated farms. Starts to let people own their own farmland again. Starts to allow people to make a little bit of money selling goods and stuff like that. And over the course of a 15-20 year period that starts in the late 70s and continues into the 90s and really picks up at, I guess it's really been a 40-year phenomenon now. Nowadays in China, there's a lot less poverty than there used to be. There's a lot of people in China actually are what you would consider middle class, whereas in Mao's day, almost everyone was poor except for Communist Party officials. And one thing that happens connected with this trade originally is that there was a certain amount of influence of Western thought that came with it, because like they were doing things like allowing Chinese students to go study abroad in like American and European universities, and then they were coming back with Western ideas. And Deng kind of thought that was just the price you had to pay to learn how to grow the economic situation. At the time, he wasn't particularly afraid that there was going to be these mass demonstrations of pro-democracy or whatever. And things begin to change where, unlike in a place like Iran, we talked about the other day, where they really shut out like American and Western cultural things, like people started listening to American music in China. They started like watching American sports, to this day. In fact, it came out, China and the NBA had a little argument this year about some stuff, and it really came out in that whole controversy that the NBA makes as much money off the Chinese market as they do the American one, or close to it. So, they start absorbing parts of like Western entertainment culture and stuff like that. Interestingly, there's actually this kind of disturbing phenomenon where a lot of movies have actually been changed to avoid offending the Communist Party, because so many Hollywood movies make so much of their money in China now that they try to not tick the commies off. But which I'm not a fan of that at all. But anyway, so what begins to happen though in around I think it was right around 1989, which if you remember is right around the time that communism is collapsing in Europe, right? Poland and Hungary have broken free. The Soviet Union is on the verge of collapse. The Berlin Wall is coming down. All this activity in the direction of anti-communism and democracy promotion in the late 1980s. This is kind of the Reagan-Bush era in the United States. In the midst of all that, there actually gets to be the first mass movement for democracy in China since like Sun Yat-sen days, all the way back before the war. And, and a lot of this is the result of having so many Chinese students having studied abroad in Western democracies and kind of finding out that they liked it better than what they were doing back home. And so they began to have some demonstrations in the streets trying to work for democracy. And the Chinese decide to deal with it with great brutality. And at an incident known as the Tiananmen Square incident. So Tiananmen Square is a famous square in Beijing, the capital city of China. It's actually where the first protest of the last Chinese emperor got started. People went to Tiananmen Square and started protesting. The Chinese government responded by rolling in, dozens of tanks. There's this one really famous photograph of one Chinese man standing in front of like a herd of like 5-6 tanks that are in the photo, about to run him over or shoot him, and he's just standing in the way courageously. It became a very, very famous photograph. And several pro-democracy protesters are killed at Tiananmen Square. And the immediate aftermath of Tiananmen Square leads to a Chinese government crackdown on democracy promotion. And over the last few Chinese leaders have gone back and forth between how extremist they are. The current ruler, Xi Jinping, is probably the most extreme that they've had since Mao. Obviously we've discussed some of the nonsense going on with whether they concealed knowledge of the coronavirus or not. But even before that, there's a group of Muslim Chinese in the eastern part of China that they're literally basically doing a genocide against, throwing them in concentration camps. They've been, they've had all sorts of terrible things have been attributed to them. Selling the organs of political prisoners was one scandal. I mean, just terrible things. And with the invention of all the internet and the facial recognition software and all the new technology, the current Chinese government has built the greatest. I mean, it's the worst, but in terms of effectiveness and size, the most intense surveillance state that any nation has ever built. They're able to spy on their people now in a way that the Soviet Union never dreamed. And they, for instance, everyone in China now is given a social credit score, which if you have too low of a social credit score, you're not allowed to get passports. You have to pay more taxes. You don't get any leniency in criminal charges, a whole bunch of things that you need to keep this number up. And if you associate with someone who's argued for democracy, not just you're doing it, you've let an old friend who did it, you let him come to your house, you lose points. So that they're trying to incentivize people to not have anything to do with anyone who talks about it. So one of the worst things that the Chinese government has done during this whole time is something called the one-child policy, which they became concerned that the Chinese population was too large to adequately feed, which, of course, the whole overpopulation thing is, we've talked about this, I think, but I know it have in economics. It's one of the dumbest myths that in the world that people believe that the world is deeply overpopulated. The reality is most nations are starting to run into the problem of not having enough children to sustain their economic growth and so on. So in the case of China, though, they were concerned with the overpopulation, and so they made it a rule that a family could only have one child. Now remember, if you're a married couple and you have 2 children, all you did is replace yourself, because you're going to die one day. So if you actually want to increase the overall population of the earth over the course of a generation, you need to have more than 2 children. So by having 1 child per couple, I mean, you're actually gonna, they were trying to achieve a lower population over time. Well, what happens to people who get pregnant after they've already had their 1 child? Well, the Chinese government literally forced them to have abortions. Literally forced them, to abort their children. And so that meant there's a whole generation of Chinese people that none of them have brothers and sisters, because it was illegal for their parents to have 2 kids. And then because Chinese culture kind of tends to believe in male superiority, this leads to a huge decrease in the female population, which leads to a huge number of Chinese men not able to find wives, so which has led to some social contention and stuff. So that was a mistake. The Chinese eventually realized it was a mistake, and they've changed it to I think 2 children now. But still, I mean, they still feel the right to tell parents how many kids they can have, which is a really tyrannical type of thing. But so the Chinese Communist Party, very, very, very bad. But nonetheless, they've emerged, and they go nuclear as well. In the 1990s, China becomes a nuclear power, and so they now have nuclear weapons, which is not good. And in the 90s, America made what was a decision that was kind of good for the short-term economy, but I think may have proved not to be worth it. And that was they opened up trade to China on a relatively free basis. Which I'm generally very pro-free trade in my political and economic views, but I think China was a bit of an exception because their government is so, evil, and I sort of don't like us supporting them. But Chinese goods started to flood the American market. I mean, the chances are you've got something made in China, you're probably wearing it right now, as a matter of fact. It's a very good chance. And so, you know, millions and millions of dollars of you know, the Chinese and American economies got, you know, have gotten mingled together and through multinational corporations and all this stuff. But most of those Chinese companies are still controlled by the state, so they're not entirely free. And they've also done, you know, a decent amount of like corporate espionage and like spying on some of our trade secrets and all this kind of stuff. Nonetheless, China has become a major player in the world market, and considers itself ready to make a challenge to become the dominant power in the world in the 21st century. We'll see how that shakes out. I hope they're wrong about that. So that's kind of Chinese history pretty much up to the present. We'll zoom just a little bit east and look at the Japanese and the South Koreans for just a moment. So the Japanese, World War II comes to an end. They, of course, are, you know, to break that never say die, never surrender culture of Shintoism and the Bushido Code and all this kind of stuff. You know, it took, you know, not one, but 2 atomic bombs to kind of convince them to back off of that never surrender culture. And then the national humiliation of one of the things that we had to do was we made Hirohito, the Japanese emperor, go on the radio and admit to the Japanese people that he was not a god, which really messed with, you know, the Japanese culture, because they had traditionally worshipped the royal family as being descended from the gods. So Japan has like this major experience that is going to allow for their culture to be, you know, very quickly changed because of the shock that came to it. MacArthur actually occupies Japan until, you know, well, the United States occupies Japan until 52, with MacArthur being the first governor. He kind of runs the show there for a little while. And they set up a government system that is, had a certain American values to it. The system actually was set up to be more like the British, because they understood Japan had this traditional monarchy. So they made a constitutional monarchy with the emperor being a figurehead, the same way the queen is in England, and then established a parliamentary democracy. And what's amazing is that Japan really takes to it very well. Japan, one of the things that we agreed to in World War II is that they agreed basically not to have an army except a very, very small defensive force. We kind of got them to agree to that by basically promising to defend them if, you know, the Russians or the Chinese tried something. So, you know, we sort of agreed to, you know, be an ally of theirs in that sort of situation. And so Japan did not actually have a fully functioning military until like the last 10 years. However, with that security blanket, they were able, like the Europeans, building up their, you know, their domestic infrastructure and so forth. The Japanese did a lot of that, and the Japanese really emerged as a major figure in manufacturing, especially of like electronics. As you know, I mean, probably your house is probably littered with Japanese brands of different types of things, whether it's Sony and Nintendo or Kawasaki, or I mean, you can go on and on with all these kind of famous Japanese brand names. And at one point in the through the 60s and 70s, Japan actually emerged as the second largest economy in the world. And a lot of people in the 1980s were actually really kind of thinking Japan might actually emerge as like our next kind of challenger for like who's going to be the most influential country in the world. Things kind of take a turn in the 90s. In the 90s, the Japanese, while things start booming in the 90s in America, and I believe in Europe as well, the Japanese, due to some decisions of their government and some other things, they actually wind up running into some economic stagnation. And they kind of get stuck in kind of an extended recession for most of the 90s and 2000s. But there was a period in the 60s, 70s, they were calling them the Japanese Tigers. And they were saying that they were the next real emerging strong country. And they did that with a fully functioning democracy, with free elections, and a stable constitution, and very much became a modern free country. Just favored the American side in the Cold War. And we had pretty close relationships with them. It's funny, I mentioned my favorite movie is Forrest Gump. My second favorite movie is Back to the Future, which ironically is the same director. And there's this one scene in there, because Marty McFly, the Michael J. Fox character, is from the 1980s, and he travels back to the 1950s. And, and in it, there's a scene that really in that movie that demonstrates the way that change in how Japan was perceived over the course of a few decades. Because in the 1950s, to say "Made in Japan" was like a joke. It kind of was a sign that, you know, if you saw "Made in Japan" in something, it meant that it wasn't very good, because they had a bad reputation as far as their manufacturing goods and stuff. And so there's this one scene where you know, Doc Brown from the 50s is working on a car, and he sees a, you know, on the time machine, you know, and there's a part that's he's having to fix, and he looks and says, "Well, no one of this thing busted. It said "Made in Japan." And Marty from the 80s looks confused and says, "What do you mean, Doc? All the best stuff comes from Japan." And it's true, because by the 1980s, Japan was far and away the leader in, especially like consumer electronics. You know, the vast majority of our, you know, televisions, many of our computers, many of our cars, you know, until Microsoft got involved, almost basically all of our video game systems, you know, they were all, you know, Japanese products. The Japanese invented the CD, or the compact disc, you know, so all these different things. So so Japan really emerges as a major modern country. A similar thing happens to South Korea, maybe not quite at the same level as Japan, but they also kind of emerge as a successful modern country with big modern cities in a you know, in a prospering economy. Tokyo, Japan, I'm pretty sure is actually the biggest city in the world, and Seoul, South Korea is not far off. So at the time of the Korean War, the head of South Korea was a fellow by the name of Syngman Rhee. We talked about that during the Korean War. But when the war is over, Rhee continues to rule until about 1960. He, although South Korea was set up to be a republic, Rhee kind of takes more and more power to himself and basically rules as a dictator, as does his successor. But there's increasing, but because South Korea is allied with the U.S. instead of the Russians, and because they're taking part in international trade with American and European companies a lot, and, you know, they're around the free world, they're connected to the free world, like Taiwan, which also emerges as a prospering country in this time, even though they lose recognition of the UN and so forth due to communist pressure. South Korea, nonetheless, emerges as a more and more prominent country in the world, and by the 1990s, they kind of finished the transformation into being a true democracy with real elections and full freedom of speech and so forth. So, so while you know, we see China goes one way, which is actually growing a little bit in economic prosperity by adding in market elements, but in the meantime also becoming more dictatorial and more repressive as far as political speech. You know, you see on the other side of the equation, Japan and South Korea kind of take the more American-like route, and it works really well for them. So that kind of brings you up to the present on Asia. When you check back on Monday, we'll kind of let you know what's been happening in Latin America. Y'all take care and have yourselves a good Mother's Day weekend.